Now this is the rucksack that's been made from my Half Yard Kids book, and then on a previous video, details down on in the words underneath this video, I showed you how to make this bag using the same style of pocket on the front, and I had so many requests on how to make that rucksack. I thought I've already shown you the pockets, so I'll show you how to make the rucksack, but this time with a flap on the front as well. So there's a lot of measuring, there's a lot of marking, because what I want you to do is to be able to create your own rucksack in any size that you like. So if you wanted to make it deeper, if you wanted to make it bigger, if you wanted to make one for a small child and make it a lot smaller, I'll give you all of the dimensions for the bag that I'm making, but then explain to you how I actually came up with those dimensions so that you can adapt them and make a bag of your own. So here we go, get your pens and papers ready and take note of these markings. So these are all of the bits and bobs that you're going to need to make up the rucksack. And remember, you can make this in any size that you like, but I'll explain the sizes that I'm using. And then, as I said previously, hopefully you'll have an understanding of the way that it works so that you can recreate this any size you like. So I have two pieces of outer fabric. That's the front and the back of my bag. These measure 15 inches down by 12 inches across. I'll put those details on the screen and I'll put them in centimetres as well. And on the back of each one of these pieces I've put some fusible fleece just to give it a little bit of rigidity. Fusible fleece is a polyester sheet that, if I just peel this back a little bit, has a glue on one side. That's the knobbly bit. So when you iron that together it becomes one. If you don't have or you can't find fusible fleece, then use either a fabric interfacing or stabilizer, which is like a thicker piece of fabric, or you could use wadding or batting and maybe even a spray adhesive to hold that in place. But even with this fabric which I'm using, which is a cotton but it's quite a heavy cotton, I still wanted to make it a little bit more sturdy. I've cut two pieces of fabric to the same size for the lining. Now I've chosen to use the same fabric. You could use a cotton if you wanted to, that or a contrasting fabric, that's entirely up to you. So 4 pieces cut to exactly the same size for the outside and the lining. Then we'll need to put in a base. Now the base of your bag is going to measure the same as the width, and then as wide or as deep as you need that bag to be, and 4 inches is kind of a good width. That's about the size that I have here on the bag that was from the book. So for my base, I've chosen a contrast fabric with the dogs on to go on the outside. So that's 12 inches by 4 inches. If you wanted to make that really thick, you could go 5 inches, 6 inches. Just be aware that the fatter your bag is, the more likely it is to actually bow underneath if you're putting lots of heavy things in there. And on the back of the outer piece I've put the fusible fleece on there again, so that's that. Then I'll need another piece for the lining to exactly the same size. On the front of my bag, so let's take the lining away so it makes sense. So there's my base, lining. I'm going to put a pocket in that contrasting colour as well. This pocket's going to go all the way across from one side of the bag to the other. So it's the same width, so that's 12 inches in width. Mine's going to be 8 inches deep. You could make it smaller, you could make it larger, that's up to you. On the bag in the book, it has the zip pockets. This one isn't going to have the zip pockets, but it is going to have the flap across the top. Now one piece of my pocket fabric, I have the fusible fleece on the back of it. That's not essential on a pocket, I just think it makes it feel nice. And I've got a lining piece which I'm using exactly the same but without the padding. For the flap, now I don't want this to be the width of the fabric, because if the flap goes into the side seam you won't be able to open it. So I've made this 11 inches wide and that's 5.5 inches deep. One piece with the fusible fleece and one piece for the lining. Then we'll need the piece that goes around the top that's going to hold the zip. So let's put all those to one side. I'm not going to measure this absolutely perfectly accurately because I want to show you how I do it, how I make this up. Before I go to the zip sections, what I'm going to do is round off these corners, and that'll give me more of an idea of the size that I need these to be. I'm using an embroidery hoop. You could use a plate or a template, and this is about 7 inches across. And let's just draw around the curves at the top. and then cut out the shape. And I'm cutting through both of the outside pieces, like so. And then I'll need to cut both of the lining pieces the same. So I'm just using that as a template. Put those to one side. So right, with the zip section, let me show you on the original bag again. It's in two halves with a zip in the centre. So I'll need 2 pieces of fabric to go on the outside and 2 pieces to go on the lining. My 2 pieces of fabric on the outside, I've got the backing, the fusible fleece, 2 pieces of the lining I haven't. The overall measurement of this section will need to be 4 inches, the same as the base. But the easiest way to do this is to cut this wider, put the zip in, press it, top stitch it, and then cut it down to the 4 inches. So my side sections at the moment are 2.5 inches wide. And imagine I'm going to lose a little bit of that into the zip, I'm going to lose a little bit of that into the side seam. So it should work out the same size, but better this to be wider than too narrow, because then you're going to have a really skinny bag. So these sections will go from here all the way around the top to the other side. So take a tape measure, and this is going to go from, let's say, 4 inches from the bottom. So I've got a nice wide opening, and that means that the bag will unzip all the way down to there. So you've got a really big opening. If you wanted to make that shorter, that's entirely up to you. So I'm going to measure 4 inches from this side as well. And then my zip section needs to be, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so a 1/4 inch longer than this, and measure all the way around. So that is 31.5 inches. I'm going to say 32 inches. This 4 inches from the base doesn't have to be 4 inches from the base. It could be 4.5, it could be 3 3/4. That's a roundabout gauge. So don't stress too much about the exact perfect measurements. So these zip panels, I need to measure and cut to 32. With the longer strips, I did use a rotary cutter ruler and mat, and I think you're going to find it so much easier. If you're doing anything like this, any kind of bag making, any kind of cushion covers or anything that you're cutting straight and square, do invest in your rotary cutter ruler and mat, because you'll find them invaluable, so much quicker and so much more accurate. Buy the biggest mats you can possibly find, and I'd recommend a 45mm rotary cutter. They're the most popular sizes. I do have a 28 and I do have a 60, but it's the 45 that I use most of the time. Right, so those are my 2 outer zip sections. I'm just going to measure against those, the 2 lining pieces, so those all measure the same size. Right. The other bits and bobs that you'll need are a zip to the same length. If anything, it's more advisable to buy a zip that's a little bit too long. This is actually a continuous zip, so it comes on a roll. You can buy these on the internet, they're quite easy to get hold of, and then you just cut it down to size, or buy a 32-inch zip and then you can cut that down. As long as it's a nylon zip, you can cut that down to any size that you like. If you're using a metal zip, it has to be exactly the right size, because you won't be able to cut that very easily. Okay, now then, we're still talking about measurements and the things that we need. Where the zip panel goes around here, we need that bottom bit. So let me just show you on the bag again. This square here. So I'm going to just cut this in half, because I've already put my backing on here. These are going to be too long, and I'm going to leave them too long for now. And I'm going to cut that straight. So we will need 2 pieces of outer fabric to go on the end, 2 pieces of lining fabric to go on the inside. And I'm going to leave those too long, just so that I make sure when I sew that whole zip panel in that it's going to fit to the base. So if this is too long, I can always cut it down to size. If it ends up being too short, I've either got to make my bag smaller or remake the whole of this bit. So I hope that makes sense so far. It certainly will do when we start sewing these together. So basically that's going to be where the zip panel goes. That goes either side of the zip, that goes in the base. That's 4 inches wide. This will be cut down to 4 inches wide after I've sewn in the zip. Okay, nearly there with your measurements and materials. You will need, for the strap at the back, your strapping. I've measured this to around about 70 inches, which is 180 centimetres, and this is 1 inch wide webbing. You can make your own straps if you like, but I think it looks so much more professional if you can buy the strap. You will need 2 sliders, which are rectangular sliders which look like this, and they measure 1 inch through the hole, so that's how your strap's going to fit in there, and that's going to make them adjustable. You will need 2 rectangular rings, these are called 1 inch rectangular rings, to attach the strap to your bag, and you will need 1 magnetic clasp to fold the flap over to secure that. Right, and you're going to need some bias binding. I will again put the measurements on the screen after I've finished, when I've worked out how much you're actually going to need. But this is 1 inch wide bias binding. I tend to buy it when I'm using so much like this because it just works out more cost effective. And that's 2 inches of fabric folded over in half, and that's going to be the trim, let me show you on the bag again, that goes all the way around the outside of the bag and across the top there. Right, so that's all the technicals and your measurements out of the way. Let's get sewing. We're going to start off by making up the zip panel. So take the 2 outside pieces, those are the pieces with the fusible fleece on the back. The zip right sides together, so wherever your slider happens to be. If this is a zip that you've bought from a shop, not pre-measured one that's not on a roll, obviously your slider is going to be at the end. A good way of sewing in zips, I find, and I know I say this a lot if you've seen any of my other videos, is to have your zip a little bit too long and then cut it down. Only with nylon zips, again, don't do that with a metal one, you'll spoil your scissors. Because now I can move that slider out of the way. I'm not having to manoeuvre my stitches around it to try and get a straight line. So make sure the slider's facing down, put the edges of your fabric together. You'll need the zipper foot on your sewing machine, and we're going to go straight down the centre of the zip. If you've not fitted a zip before, I'm just going to move that a little bit more out of the way. Most zips will have a different weave down the centre of the tape, and that's right down the middle, so that's a good guideline to actually sew. I don't tend to pin with these because by the time you've put your pins in and taken them out, I could have had the whole zip put in. So I'm just lining at the edge of the zip with the edge of the fabric. And that's the edge of the fabric, not the edge of the fusible fleece, which has grown a little bit at the side. That is absolutely fine, don't worry about that. So that's how we're looking. Now I'll need to put the lining on the opposite side, so fold the zip back over again, and just chop off that thread. Take your lining section and put that right sides together. Now I can't see the zip, it's sandwiched in the middle. So what I find is easier if I start from the opposite end, right sides together, sew from this side, sew from the side that you've already stitched, and then you can see where you're sewing. So line up the 2 edges of the fabric, don't worry about that zip being too long, back under the machine. And then we're going to sew again edges together, straight on top of the stitch line that I've already made, all the way down. So there's my zip sandwiched in between the two pieces. Don't worry about this, all of that will be chopped down to size later on. If you're a seasoned sewer, then you may want to do both of those sides at the same time. There's no reason why you couldn't just sandwich the whole layer together and sew all in one go. But I just thought if you're new to sewing, and I know a lot of you are, then that makes it a little bit clearer as to what you're going to do. Okay, so these two pieces you've already sewn, let's move those out of the way, and we're going to do exactly the same on the opposite side of the zip. So padded piece, right sides together, so on top of the piece that you've already sewn, line up these two edges here. Actually, I'm going to start from the other end so I can see the zip. There we go. Padded pieces together. This fleece is like a thread magnet. Okay, like so. So from this side, make sure all of that's out of the way. That will be pressed and top stitched when I finish doing this, so it's going to look nice and neat and tidy. Now your lining, again, just like we did before, let's start from the opposite end, is going to go on the opposite side of your zip, like so. And again, sew straight over the top of the stitch line that you've just made. So that's the panel almost completed. If I open this up now, you can see that's the outside with the wadding on the back. That's the lining. So what I'm going to do now, and we're going to go and press this. Medium iron with nylon zips, if you don't mind. And just press that as far away, really press it away from the zip in the centre. And then when I come back again, I'm going to do a top stitch either side of the zip, just like I did on the original bag here. And that keeps the fabric away from the zip, and it keeps it looking nice and flat as well. So I'll go and iron that. I'll see you in a second. Right, so almost finished with the panel. Now we need to trim it down to the right size and the right width. So I'll take one of my cutting mats and my ruler and my rotary cutter, and we need this to be 4 inches wide, remember. So if I put the 2-inch mark right down the centre here, do that the other way around. So right down the centre of the zip, and then trim that back. And the same on the other side. If you've not used a rotary cutter before, always, always, always cut away from you. So now I'm lining up the 4-inch mark on this side, so that's in a straight line here. The 2-inch mark is right down the centre of my zip. So now when I trim, I've got a perfect 4-inch width. Another thing you need to do is make sure that your blade always retracts when you're not using it. So this is an Alpha rotary cutter. It automatically retracts, but it will lock, so now it won't open it accidentally. Some of your cutters will have a guard that you need to put on them, but these are incredibly sharp, so do make sure that you're protected. Okay, then we're going to go straight over the end of the zip. So I lined the sides of the zip up with that 4-inch mark again, so I know that this is a right angle and that's straight. Off you come. And then the same on this end, make sure that your slider is actually in the panel, not off the end, because otherwise you're going to chop it off. Okay, and then let's line that up. Off you go. If you're doing this by hand and with scissors, I would still use a long ruler and mark with a marking tool, an eraser blink pen or something like that, just to make sure that you get the accurate measurements. The next thing I'm going to do before we start sewing any more pieces together is to sew the end of the zip closed. And this just makes it easier when I'm sewing this onto the end panel, so that it doesn't open as I'm sewing. So if I sew within the seam allowance, so close to the edge, then I don't need to unpick this when I start to sew the bag together. Right, so that's the zip section finished. What I need to do now is to put on those 2 end pieces. So this is the top of the panel with the slider on the top and the padded side to the top. I'm going to take the padded side of that 4-inch strip that goes on the end of there and sew that right sides together just across the end. It's a nice idea actually if you've done it before to put a strip of piping across here. That gives a really nice professional finishing touch. Okay, and then the second half, which is the lining side, so the non-padded side, goes right sides together across the opposite side. Line those up, and I'm sewing across the same stitch line again. Just like I did with the zip, I'd take these to the ironing board and flatten them out and then top stitch to keep them in place. I'll do that without pressing for now, so I don't have to go away and come back again. Just on the one side, you don't need to sew across the zip section. Oh, under you go. There we go. The fabric's getting a little bit thick there now. So just take your time, over the zip and down the opposite side. Right, so that's the whole panel finished. Before we put this onto the front of the bag, I'm going to put the pocket on. So there we go, there's my pocket flap and there's the actual pocket. I don't need to sew the sides of the pocket and the lining together. What I do need to do is to sew the bottom and across the top, and that'll make it into a tube. Same on the other side here. Then we'll turn this the right side out. Again, if your iron's on, go and press that now. I'm going to go to the top of the pocket, so making sure the fabric's the right way round, and then with the seam on the top I'm going to edge stitch across here. A nice look, if you've used a different colour of the lining, is to allow the seam to fall forward. In fact, let's do that. So it creates like a border across the top. Now I'm going to pin this in position on the front of my bag. Wherever you want, could be higher up, could be lower down. If you're going to have the pocket going all the way down to the bottom, then there's no need to put this bottom seam in here. Okay, so you can measure that and make sure it's perfectly straight if you like. I'm just going to put a mark on the bottom of here because I'll take the pocket off in a second to put the magnetic clasp on, which I'm going to do in just a second, and I'll explain why. With the flap, that goes over the top here. I've rounded off the corners of the bottom of the flap, and all I've done is used around about a 4-inch template, which is an embroidery hoop. Could be a plate, could even be the reel from your ribbon or something like that. Just draw around that and make that into a curve. And do the same with the lining section. Now your magnetic clasp is going to go fat half on the pocket, thin half on the lining. And if you haven't done one before, this is how you do it. If you have, fast forward this little bit, you'll have seen it before. So I need to measure and mark the centre point of the lining of the flap. So the easiest way to do that is to just fold it in half and finger crease it. Make a mark where you want the clasp to go. Remember, this is the thin bit, by drawing through the back of the clasp like that. Don't come too close to the edge here because you're going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and if I was to put the clasp there, I'm not going to get my sewing machine foot around it. I'll hit it, I'll break needles on it. So make sure that you're around about 1 inch at least from the edge of your fabric. Then I'm going to put a mark. Let me do this on the right side actually. I'm going to put a mark here and a little line either side. And that's where the legs of the clasp are going to go. And I'm marking it from this side before I make the holes because I'm going to put a little scrap of fabric just behind there, just to strengthen it a little bit. So just about the size of the back of the clasp, I'm going to spray a little bit of glue just on the back of there to hold it in place. Don't need to do that, it'll help. And that's going to go on the back there. And then you'll need either a really sharp pointy pair of scissors or your quick unpick, and we're going to make 2 little holes on those side marks. The smaller the hole the better, because you can make a small hole bigger. If you make a big hole, you'll need to cut out another piece of fabric. Then the prongs of your legs, your prongs of your clasp go through, pop the back on here, and then open it out. Then we're going to sew the flap together before I measure the other side. So that's going to go like that. Tidy you up a little bit. You can come back over here. And we're just going to sew around the curved side. So there's my pocket. That's how it's going to fasten. But I'm just going to neaten across the top with some bias binding, so I thought I'd show you how to do that. The bias binding that goes all the way around the outside of the bag is half machine sewn and half hand sewn. So I'm afraid there is a lot of hand sewing in this one. But this one I'm just going to machine sew. So turn your bias binding over to the wrong side and open out the edge. And we're going to sew along that crease line, but leave this overhanging by about ½ an inch either side, because we need to make that nice and neat. And then you're simply going to sew straight along that crease mark with the edges together. Use a nice soft bias binding as well, it does make a difference. Some bias bindings can feel really scratchy, not very nice. And you can almost see the weave on them as well. So if you can, when you go into your haberdashery store or your fabric store, touch it. Right. So this is going to fold over the top, like so. I need it to fold over so that it goes just beyond where that stitch line is, or on that stitch line. And then I know from this side, when I sew the machine, I'm catching the back bit. You're not going to see the back of this, so don't worry too much about this section. It's more important that the stitches on the top are looking nice and neat. So when you fold it over, wrap the end of the bias binding over the end of your pocket and then fold it, and you'll have a nice neat corner there. So I'm going to lock, whoops, I'm going to do that again. I'll just put a pin in there because my machine pushed it out of the way. There we go. So let's make sure that doesn't come undone. Lock the stitch at the end here, or do a reverse stitch if you don't have a lock stitch on your machine. And then we can just sew, under you go, quite close to the seam. Nice, neat, straight stitches. If you wanted to pin or clip this as you go, feel free. Just making sure it's all the same width. Nice, neat stitch line. And then just before I come up to the other end, I'm going to trim that back just a little bit, and just the same as I did before, wrap over the end and fold that over. It's like wrapping up a Christmas present. Make a nice neat corner there. That's that. Okay, we'll cut my thread off. Then we'll take this to our rucksack, fasten it, flatten it, make it straight so that's all the same distance across the top. Then we'll pin it, and then we'll sew it. And this time I'm just going to sew across the top of the bias binding. Make sure you go backwards and forwards a couple of times, lock your stitches, or even sew a little triangle on the end, because we don't want it to come off basically. So you want a nice strong end, each end to your seam, so it can take any kind of strain. There, looking good. That just needs a press, stretching out and pressing, and that'll be nice and flat across the top. Righty-ho, so that's the front done. We need a little bit of work to do on the back, because this is where the straps are going to go. Right, so I've already done that one. That's the lining. Oh, that's my back panel. So cut 2.5 inch strips. You'll need 2 of those for this bag. and you're going to thread one of each of the strips through a rectangular ring. There we go. So just thread it through, fold it over, and then sew to the side of the bag. About 1.5 inches from the bottom, same on both sides. This webbing does tend to fray quite a lot. So small stitches just within the seam allowance, so close to the edge, just to hold those in place. So do one of those either side. Then with the top section of the bag, you'll cut a length of webbing. This one measures 28 inches. Make that longer or shorter, so you could measure with a piece of ribbon or something first of all, just to make sure it's going to be the right length for you. And you're going to sew one end through the centre of the rectangular slider. This bit may fray, so cut that back as neatly as you can, and you can either do a zigzag stitch straight over the end like a satin stitch, or if you're careful you can use a candle or a lighter and just burn the edges, and that'll stop it from fraying. Do be careful. Okay, now your slider may be slightly curved like this one is, so I want to thread this through, so from under the curve over the top and down to the other side, and you'll need to pull it out enough so that you can clear your sewing machine foot away from the metal work. And then either a zigzag stitch or just a straight stitch, but go backwards and forwards a few times just to strengthen it. Should have changed to black thread really, but I might colour that in later. Right, now what we need to do here is to take the opposite end, do this so you can see, the opposite end of the webbing, go through the loop here, with the seam that you've just made with like the raw edge sticking upwards. Thread that back through one side of the slider, and back through the other side, and then that one's going to be sewn to the top of the bag. So now this is adjustable. So again, with the seam, the raw edge facing upwards, through the rectangular ring, back through the slider, back through the other side. Then these are going to be sewn to the top. Now I'm going to again fold it in half to mark the centre point here, and making sure the straps aren't twisted, I'm going to sew these either side, about 2 inches either side of the centre, so they're even, same distance away from the middle. No need to burn the edges of these because they're going to be within the seam. There, now we're starting to look like a rucksack. Now, as we're putting bias binding all the way around the edge of the bag, so I'll just show you on this one again, all of the seams need to be pointing outwards. So it's a little bit like sewing back to front, if you like. And then I get a nice neat seam on the inside here. You can see I keep my plastic in mine. So that's the kind of seam that normally you'd see on the outside of the bag, but this time that's going to be inside because this is finished with the bias binding. Okay, so it made seem a little bit odd putting it together that way. What you've also got inside this bag, remember this is the one that I made from the book, is a zip pocket, invaluable. But you're going to be here all day if I show you how to do that with this bag, so I do have another video to show you how to do that. Okay, so you can go down there. Right, I have a piece of scrap paper and I've got some spray adhesive, and I'm going to just adhere the linings to the back of these pieces, just roughly like so, before I sew. So if you're using a patterned fabric, remember we're not going to turn this inside out now, so you want your pattern fabric facing upwards, so your wrong sides are together. And we need to do this for all the pieces, front, back and base. Don't have to glue it if you don't have any, you know, don't rush out and buy something specially. But it is very useful. Either Crafter's Companion Stick and Spray, or you can use 505. And you can still move things around, which is quite nice. And then the bottom bit, we'll do the same here. And then we can start sewing this all together. Here we go. So let's start with the front section in the zip. Wrong sides together, remember. So I'm going to fold over and mark the centre point. And I'll put an ink mark on there as well, just so that the crease doesn't disappear. And with the zip panel, fold the zip in half as well and do the same on both sides. There and there. Okay, so we need that piece with the zip panel going around the outside. Make sure the zip's facing the right way. So there's the mark I made, and the mark I made there. And I'm going to clip this time because I find it easier with thicker pieces of fabric. And we're going to clip this around the sides. And then we're going to sew. Now, do you remember way back at the beginning of this video where I said that the sides were going to be too long? This is why. Oops. Just get some more clips. There we go. So as I come down the straight side here, don't need so many clips in there. That's why your flap's going to be a little bit shorter, so it's not going to disappear inside the side seam. Right, and the side panel's longer here. I can trim that back down to size again. And it's just it's a foolproof way of making sure that it's going to fit. Okay, let's go around the other side. So we'll clip this and then I'll sew. Then I'm going to do the same with the back and sew. And then I'll come back and show you how I put the base in. Really coming together now. So again, all of these raw edges all facing outwards, which feels a little bit wrong, but that's right. There's the straps on the back. Now let's put the base in. So before I do this, I'm going to open the zip, just in case I need to get inside and manoeuvre things around. Right, so I'm going to have the pattern side on the outside. That's the bit that had the wadding on it, and the grey side on the inside. And these again are sewn wrong sides together. The tip is here. It's very tempting when you start to sew these pieces together. Let me show you a corner. To start with the corner right in there like that. Don't. Start with it overlapping by your seam allowance. So in effect, the edges are starting to be sewn together here. So this bit is going to be about 1/4 of an inch in. And we'll clip. So just like before, keep the edges together. I am sewing quite close to the edge because remember the bias binding is going to go over the edge of here. I'll start to sew. I'll be there all day clipping. So you don't have to start right in the corner. In fact, it may be easier to start a little way down. Keep your needle down when you're not sewing. Keep all of this out of the way and keep the edges lined up together. Try not to pull the fabric because we don't want to distort it. And again, so keep your stitches about 1/4 of an inch from the edge all the way around. Now when I'm coming up to this corner, I've got the side section folded out of the way, so I'm just keeping these long pieces together. And when I come right into that corner section, I'm going to stop 1/4 of an inch from the edge, like so, one more. And you should be able to feel when you actually hit that seam. And then lift your foot up with the needle still down, and we're going to push all of this lot out of the way and twist this around. So I'm just sewing across the short bit. Okay, all of that out of the way. This is the important bit. Needle down and do the same on this side. So again, line the edges up together. Quite a lot of fabric, so you know, persevere. Push you out the way, join you in there. And here, and again stop 1/4 of an inch from the edge. We are going to go over this again, remember, with the bias binding. So things will look a lot neater then. So again, push all of that gubbins out of the way this side. Back down here. Into the last corner here, and then we'll carry on around that side. What I need to do now is to trim away any threads, anything that's going to be bumpy, anything that's sticking out a little bit. So I've got a nice neat edge before I sew my bias binding on. Right, so we're going to start with the front and the back pieces first of all. Again, have that a little bit too long, and we're going to sew this right sides together. It is quite bulky now, you may need your denim needle on your sewing machine, like so, and then that's going to wrap over the edge. So sew from the top, as in the machine stitch from the front, you machine stitch from the back, so your hand stitching is going to be on the panel at the side here. Here we go. Let's do the front first. So moving the back of the bag out of the way. I find it easier not to even clip this. There's nowhere to clip, so this is the easiest way to do it. Let's line that up, those edges, and go under your machine. Plug in your foot pedal, which has just come out. Here we go, right. So over the pockets, that's quite bulky now. Making sure that the edge is lining up, no threads there. I can trim this back a little bit more if I need to, I'll show you that in just a second. Making sure this is out of the way. Right, so now when I turn this back, you can see I've got a nice neat outline. Now then, at this point, if things aren't going according to plan, we can always go back over the stitches again, and I want to point out where things didn't go quite according to plan, and that's just at the side here. So I can still see the stitches, and I can still see the end of the pocket, which means that my bias binding hasn't been sewn far enough inwards. So I'm just going to unpick that little bit and re-sew it. See, things don't go perfectly for everybody first time. Sometimes not even second times. Hopefully by third time you'll be fine. There we go, almost there. That's it. So I'm not unpicking all the way around, just over the little bit that I need to re-sew. And then I'll move the edge of that back over again and just sew over that same piece. So now that section's neater. What I've also done while I was there was to sew the bias binding onto the back, like so. And again, I've just checked that that's nice and neat with no puckers and no little pleats, and I haven't missed any bits all the way around. So before I sew the base, because I want to, when I sew the bias binding around the base, I want this bit to be tucked underneath. So I'm going to start hand sewing now. Now then, if there's any lumpy bits here, basically when you pull the bias binding over and sew, you want to cover up all of those stitches. So no matter how many rows of stitching you've got there, they need to be covered over. And as you can see, you start to get a really nice neat finish. That bit's a little bit lumpy. I can trim that down. If you come around to the corners and maybe this is a little bit thick, you can trim that down. So nothing wrong with that whatsoever. The important thing is that your stitches or your bias binding is going to completely disguise those stitches. So, I mean, don't chop it all off, but you can keep kind of just trimming that so that, where have you gone? There you are. So that that folds over neatly. And although normally with bias binding you shouldn't need to do that, look at the thickness of the fabric that you're folding that over. So that's going to add to the amount of bias binding, or the width of the bias binding if you like. So don't go any less than 1 inch in your width when you're doing it. Okay, so let's start sewing. So I'm going to use a slip stitch. I like to start with my knot out of the way somewhere, so in that seam. I know this looks messy, it won't, it's all going to be covered up. And then pull this over the top. Use the same colour thread as your bias binding, not your base fabric. And you're going to put a little stitch just into the fold and try not to wrap it around your scissors as you're doing it. Then underneath that stitch, go directly into your fabric, bring the needle out again into the fold, around about 1/8 of an inch apart. The smaller the stitches, the more time consuming, but the neater it's going to look. So again, into the base fabric, out onto the fold, pull through. So your stitch is actually a little line as close to the edge of that fold as you can get it, and it just makes like a little dot. So I'll just do a few more so you can see how it's looking on the other side as well. Your alternative for this, to be honest, if you really don't have the patience to make this an incredibly neat job, because this is the most time consuming bit, it's worth it, I think. I find it quite relaxing, to be honest. I like doing this. Would be to do this on the inside of the bag. So where I sewed all of these seams together with the outside, just do that on the inside, because it's not so important on the inside, unless you're selling it, of course. So you could get away with larger stitches, or if you're not a confident stitcher, then it doesn't matter so much on the inside if your stitches aren't so straight. Okay, just keep going. You can see why it's going to take so long. It's just worth it. You could machine sew this. To be honest, to try and get a perfectly straight stitch mark all the way through on both sides oh gosh, you'd be sewing it and unpicking it and sewing it, or tacking it. You may as well just hand sew it. Right, so that's just a few inches, but when I turn this over now to the right side, that's what you're going to see from the front. Okay, so I'm going to finish off sewing this. You don't have to watch that. Go and put the kettle on or something. And then I'm going to put the bias tape around the bottom in just the same way. So look how good we're looking at the moment. So again, I've hand sewn all the way around here. It took me about an hour to do all of that. And I just need to put the bias binding around the bottom and then we're done. So let's trim these extra little tufts of bias binding back. That will do. Now because we're going around in a square, I need to make the ends of the bias binding neat. I could snip away at these all day. They seem to grow. So I'm sewing from the top again, and I'm going to fold the end of my tape over. I'll just cut that off straight, better. I'll start at the back so that we don't see that seam, and fold the end of your bias tape over to make it neat. And then when we go all the way around, the second side tucks inside so you don't see the raw edge of the bias tape. Okay, so we'll sew this in. And then just like I did with the outside section, I'll hand sew to the other side. Right. Now when I'm getting to the corner, that bit is particularly lumpy. So just take it really slowly as you go over the bias binding. So I'm just coming back up to the end now, so this is where the overlap is. So I'm just going to trim back the bias binding with the biggest scissors in the world and sew over the join like that. Right, now I need to check, just like I did before on the side sections, that I haven't missed any bits and that this is all looking neat. That's fine. And I will need to trim away some of this. I think that bit's not so bad, but the corners will need trimming off. Let's turn it over. This bit looks a little bit thick, so we'll trim that back. Because remember, this again is going to go all the way over that seam and round to the other side. I'll need to trim quite a bit from there actually. Careful not to cut through the bias binding, so that when it comes over here, I don't see any of those stitches and the raw edges. Then just like the sides, when I've trimmed it back, I'm going to finish hand sewing it and then we're done. So there we are, rucksack all finished. So I finished off the bias binding by hand around the bottom, nice and neat around the sides, and those are those straps on the back, which again, because I put the sliders, whoops, on there, are adjustable, so you have your perfect fit. So enjoy designing and making up yours.